Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
And thank you, we're back. This is Talking Books and Writing and Stuff, and today we're talking about books and writing and a whole lots of other stuff with Erik Raschke. We caught him just after he got out of a traffic jam, as it were, on the world-famous George Washington Bridge. So what, you were driving from Manhattan to New Jersey? Is that your daily commute these days?
Yes, it is. I moved here from Amsterdam, and I've been putting my son into a special school in New Jersey for autism, and so I actually had to. I started working again before my book came out and everything, and for years I was a teacher in the Bronx, in inner city schools, and I just started to call them. When I came back, I'm like, hey, I'm here for a while. I'm putting my son in school. Do you have anything? And they're like, yes, please come back. So, and actually, it was one of my favorite jobs I had for, in the past. But, the last 13 years I was in Europe, and I was teaching at the university, and now I'm back into inner city Bronx kids, and I just really every day I sort of realized, God, I miss it. It was so nice to be around. I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's definitely a hard job, but I love it. It's so satisfying on so many levels. So that's my commute. It's from the Bronx to New Jersey. So
how long does that take you on a good day?
On a good day, it takes 40 minutes.
40 minutes. And
yeah, so it's not bad, because I always had sort of a bad idea of New Jersey, but I'm here and I live right next to a forest. Like, we have deer and bears and raccoons, and you can go out hiking and not see anybody for hours. It's really. I'm from Colorado. I grew up in Colorado, so I always sort of sneer at New Jersey wilderness, but it's really beautiful here. So
let's see, a commute. I used to live in Bellingham, Washington, and drive to Vancouver, BC. It was 2 hours each way, so 40 minutes is a piece of cake.
Yeah. That's a long stretch there, yeah.
Well, that's out on the wet coast, and so, Seattle, Vancouver, they're just the worst places in the history of the world. I don't know why people live there at all. We're out in the middle of nowhere. When my wife was working in the city, as we call it, it took her 35 to 40 minutes to get to work. So.
Oh yeah, my mom used to live on Bainbridge Island, and she called her commute one of the best commutes. The commute is my best part of my day. She would get on the ferry. And then she would just go, and then she'd go across the Sound. And then when she got into Seattle, she would get off and go straight to work. Her work was right there. And she was like, my commute is one of the best commutes I've ever had in my entire life. She's like, it's a vacation, It's so beautiful there. So
we're talking with Erik Raschke here on Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. No, you did not tune into a station with news and weather and traffic on the 10s together. It's Erik Raschke from back east in New Jersey, New York City, talking about his teaching career in the Bronx. But he's got a book out that I have in my hand right here. It's called To the Mountain. And I understand, Erik, this is your second published book, and the first one, the Book of Samuel. So maybe we'll start with you telling us about the Book of Samuel.
Sure, yeah. The Book of Samuel came out 10 years ago, I think, 10 or 11 years ago. And it's a book about, it's very autobiographical. It's about growing up in Denver, Colorado. And it's about a boy he's a 12-year-old, the narrator's 12, and his father thinks that he's Jesus, or Jesus is speaking to him. And so his father leaves the house to go off and save the world. And meanwhile, this 12-year-old narrator, Samuel, has to sort of keep the whole house together. His mother has to work really hard, and she's depressed, and their grandmother moves in, and she's got Alzheimer's, and she makes causes chaos everywhere. And then he also has his cousin, who is sort of an orphan, moves into, and so he has all these things sort of going on in his life that while his father is away saving the world, he's holding the house together, and sort of, yeah. I used a lot of the Book of Samuel and a lot of Christian themes and stuff like that. I mean, it's not a Christian book by any stretch, but I tried to stay because the father is, Jesus. I tried to play with a lot of those themes and stuff like that. But that was 10 years ago when that book came out, and since then I had a son who was autistic, and that just pretty much consumed a lot of my last decade. So now that he's a lot older, I'm having more time to write. So a few years ago, I was able to sort of start putting together this book, To the Mountain, and writing it. So. And that's how one led to the other.
That brings us to today. But meanwhile, back in Erik Raschke's earlier life, you were in the Peace Corps. You worked for newspapers in Northern Ireland, I think it was, in Belfast. You went to Armenia, ended up teaching in the Netherlands or Holland. Where did all this begin? Where did you... Where'd you go to university, and then how did the rest of that evolve from there?
Yeah, gosh. I don't know how interesting this is to your listeners, but I'll try and sort of sum it up. I guess after college, undergraduate, I was my junior year abroad. I went to Belfast and Derry, and it was still during the Troubles.
Right.
So there was still the military was there everywhere, and everything was sectioned off, and you had to, for a kid coming from Colorado, I went to school at Earlham College in Indiana, and then I had my junior year abroad in Northern Ireland, and a kid coming from Colorado, and then all of a sudden living in basically what's a war, there's car bombs going off and shootings all the time, and it was quite an experience, and I loved it. It was amazing because the people, I guess during wartime experiences, people take on, you think people are cruel to each other, and you hear all these stories, but there's actually like this sort of, I don't want to say celebratory, but there's this sort of joyous thing where everybody's like, this is horrible, let's come together and be close. And so, I mean, it was divided if I was Protestant Catholics, but as an American, you could go from either side pretty easily because it was still a time when everybody still loved America, and especially the Irish, So they would you could go with open arms anywhere, and that was also like when I was a reporter for a newspaper. They would send me out to places where they didn't have a reporter they could go to, and I had studied. I had almost gone to school for journalism as an undergraduate, and got accepted to like Columbia and stuff like that. And at the last minute, I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to be a journalist. I want to be a writer, like a fiction writer. And so, but I still worked in the newspaper. And like the first day I was there, second day, the reporter I was with, he lost his notes, and I had taken notes because I knew how to do shorthand. Huh? And from that point on, they were giving me bylines on like the front and second page, and they were sending me off to go do all sorts of really exciting stuff. And I got to see, also I was pushy. I was like, can I go? And I was, I had plenty of time. So I saw some pretty crazy stuff. I saw, after the IRA or the UBF or whoever would, blow up something, we would be the first ones there. We'd follow the smoke and go there, and you would see the aftermath of that kind of stuff. And, it was for a, 20-year-old, it was pretty intense, but it was also an amazing experience, and, got to see conflict very close up, and what it does. And like I said, because I was an American, I could go to families of the Protestants who had lost somebody, and I could go to the families of the Catholics who had lost somebody, and they would all talk to me because I was an American. So that gave me really big access to write stories that the other reporters didn't have. So And then I, after college, I was like, I really want to travel some more, and I didn't have any money, of course, and so I joined the Peace Corps, and I went to Armenia, and you don't have a choice whether they send you to the Peace Corps, or they just sent me there, and I think probably because I was from Colorado and Armenia's in the mountains, and they sent me to a really small little mountain town, and they're like, go teach English, and I get there, and it's the Soviet Union had just collapsed like 3 or 4 years before then.
Oh.
So it was pretty. That was really interesting in its own way, because you get to see it was a very functioning society. They had the electricity, they had all of these sort of modern conveniences from the Soviet Union, and then literally within half a year it just collapsed. There was no electricity, there was no I mean, it was, but it was on the hydro dams and stuff like that, because under the Soviet Union, they had to import everything. So, like, for example, the houses in Armenia are built really, really big, and they don't have any insulation. And the reason they don't have insulation is because if you insulated a house, then you'd use less energy. But they wanted to keep the mine workers in Siberia busy and working hard. So they would transport energy all the way down to Armenia and then warm up they would encourage people to build these big houses that just sucked out of the electricity. And so when Armenia left the Soviet Union cut them off from everything. So all of a sudden you have these people living in these enormous houses, and they can only live in one room, and they're freezing, because they're burning everything that they can around them just to keep their one room warm. So, and like, for example, everybody had everybody had lamps and stuff everywhere. There was really nice lamps, and everywhere you went, you would see these really nice lamps and floor lamps, ceiling lamps, etc. But the light bulbs were all made in the portion of Russia that was in conflict with the Soviet Union. I mean, it was so complicated, so nobody could get light bulbs. So you'd also have these people, these enormous houses, these big mansions, walking around from room to room, screwing in a light bulb. Their one light bulb that they had left, sort of doing it. So that was also just a really fascinating experience to see, like, what happens when you have something, a functioning society just immediately collapse and sort of fall into disrepair. And yeah, it was a similar thing. I was in a village, so it was much nicer. I had a much nicer experience than other Peace Corps people, because they were in cities, and it was a lot harder to survive. You couldn't, where I was in a village, people could grow their own crops, and they had cows and milk and all sorts of stuff. So as long as you have food, you can stay relatively happy. Right. Simple but happy. And in the cities, it was just a constant struggle, I think. So, yeah, that was also a wonderful experience. And also, I was like, well, these people don't need to learn English right now. They need water, they need, electricity, they need all sorts of things. So I spent a lot of time I was still teaching English, but I spent a lot of time just trying to help the NGOs and the aid organizations get in and connect with people so that they could start projects and stuff. So, yeah.
So it sounds like there could be a book there as well.
Actually, no, it's funny, because my next book, actually, I wrote it while I was there, and I picked it up, I don't know, maybe like 2 years ago or something like that. I found it, and I was like, usually going back and reading your stuff you've written in the past, you're like, oh gosh, although Mark Twain once said, the best stuff I ever wrote was when I was a teenager. So, but I went back and I looked at it, and I was like, wow, there's a lot of good stuff here. And it was funny, because I'm like, I was a very observant person back then. What happened to me, And it was really good. It needed a lot of work, but I went back and I spent about a year reworking it, and trimming. They had two different main characters, and I focused on one main character, and just really, really trimmed it down and made it work. And now I gave it to an editor here in New York, who I was like, can you just tell me what you think? Like, did I pull it off? Right. Because this is a 40-year-old me rewriting something from when I was 20. Is this possible? And then she loved it. She's like, this is fantastic. This is so good. I was like, yes, I did it. So that's, hopefully, we'll see. I mean, I'm finishing it up now with the edits and stuff like that. We'll see. That should hopefully be my next book. So.
Well, sure, we'll look forward to that. But this is Talking Books, etc. with Erik Raschke, and the book is To the Mountain. And I must confess, I just started it. I'm in the first few pages, so sorry. But right off the bat, the protagonist, the young boy involved, it sounds like he's in some sort of an institution. He doesn't know, or he doesn't want to know, how to read clocks or tell time or figure out the dates or calendars, but he knows what time it is by the smells, and he is autistic, I take it. So what inspired you to come up with a plot that sort of starts off with a kid in an institution who can't tell time?
Yeah, I mean, basically it's entirely based off my son. I mean, the main character is, what my experience with my son. And I mean, literally every morning my son wakes up and goes, "What time is it?" And I was like, "Just ask Alexa," or something. Like, we literally go through this every single morning. He's 14 now. Still, always, "What time is it? What time is it?" I'm like, "Stop asking me. I'm not a clock." But he literally can't. He can figure out all sorts of other things. He's really smart. And he knows. You give him a rap song, and he can pretty much tell you every sample that goes to it, but he can't tell you the time. So, and he does tell time. He knows what time of day it is, literally through the motions of the day, like the smells and the sounds and stuff like that. And that is really how he navigates his days, is sort of, through these sort of abstract things that we don't necessarily pay attention to. And, it's a wonderful thing to see. So, I mean, I've actually had him on a couple past interviews with me so that people can sort of see what he's like too, because it's I think it's important to understand that autism isn't like it's not, people aren't, they're not smart, it's that it's just a whole different way of seeing the world. It's just a completely alternative way of seeing the world, and it works somehow. In some ways it works, in some ways it doesn't. And so this boy is basically my son. And I never would have been able to write it if it wasn't for my son. So.
And the book is To the Mountain by Erik Raschke. And what happens is that 11-year-old Marshall, I'm reading from the back cover because I like to cheat, him and his buddy escaped during a blizzard. And in Colorado, I take it. We know all about blizzards here in rural Saskatchewan. Every once in a while, we had one in November or December, and then the snow was just starting to melt now. But apparently at the same time, you, like you said, grew up in Colorado, so you did lots of outdoor stuff, so you combined your outdoor type experience with the autistic nature to create the plot?
I did, yeah. I did that. I had been reading a lot about, there's this whole thing called feral children, and back before they had institutions, people who couldn't take care of their autistic kids would just sort of put them out in the forest, and they would find these kids that had grown up, as babies basically, who'd grown up in the wild, and they couldn't speak English, and they couldn't speak at all, and they didn't know how to eat. They had none of the how do you say sorry, they had none of the things of they didn't understand what society was, and so especially for like the Victorians and stuff like this, it became this wonderful sort of experiment. And Truffaut actually made a movie called Wild Child, very famous French movie about this particular thing, and it was all sort of like what happens when people survive in the wilderness versus in society, and why does society make these children suffer? Because a lot of these kids were brought back into society and they just couldn't make it, but they had made it really well in the forest. So I was playing a lot with that idea too, and my editor at one point was like, I didn't have it set anywhere. I had it in the mountains in a forest, and he was like, you have to ground it somewhere. You have to put it somewhere. I was like, I'm this very literary writer. That's who I am. I like to have this sort of grand metaphor. He's like, no. You got to ground it. So I was like, okay, I can't be high and lofty. You won't let me. So I grounded it in Colorado, which is, where I grew up and what I love, and it's my favorite place. So that's how it wound up in Colorado in the snows. But yeah, I used a lot of Colorado and the nature and stuff like that to sort of bring that into the book and make it more alive. So.
And also, apparently, your son, you read the story to him and To the Mountain, and he didn't have any problems with it?
No, he didn't. I was very lucky. I was really worried that he wouldn't like it, and no, he really likes it, and yeah, but it was very clear. It was one of those things where I was like, oh, in the past, I give it to my wife, and I'm worried what she might think of stuff, but this time it was him, and he really liked it a lot, and he, like I said, he's been helping me out too, doing different things and answering questions sometimes here and there, and so that's also giving him sort of the part of this process too has been, it's been giving me a lot of confidence too going into it, because yeah, I mean, if he hadn't have liked it, if he was like, this isn't me, I don't like this, blah, it would have been a lot harder to do this,
right.
To give interviews and talk about it, I would have felt like a huge fraud, so yeah, it's nice.
It's To the Mountain, the book by Erik Raschke, an autistic 11-year-old named Marshall. In a blizzard, him and his buddy kind of find themselves on the outs after all sorts of problems occur at the institution, I'll call it, where they are. So they're out in the wilderness and going to the mountain. Erik Raschke, you have 3 boys now. One's autistic. How do the other 2 accept their brother?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a very interesting dynamic. My 11-year-old son, who is a little bit closer to him, I think, it's his brother, but they're more like brothers. They fight about stuff, and he gets annoyed at it. But he's also very, he's also very caring and loving. But the funny dynamic is actually I have a son who's 4 years old, and he is, they have a very funny dynamic together, because he's really sharp when it comes to like having your shoes on the right feet, or having your shirt on backwards, or he's just very sharp on these details. And my other son, my autistic son, he always has his shoes on the wrong feet, and he always has his clothes on inside out and backwards and stuff like that. And so, but my 4-year-old also can't reach certain things. He needs help opening things and stuff like that. So they have this really, like, the 4-year-old will be like, you have your shoes on backwards, you gotta turn around, or you need to go brush your teeth now, or something like that. So he orders him around, and then my autistic son will help pick him up and help him reach for things and help him draw things and stuff like that. So it's really cute to watch, and, but yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons why we left Amsterdam and tried to come here and try and make it work at the school is because I also just really don't want them to have to take care of him full time, and so that's what the goal right now is, to have him have an education and a quality of life where he can have a job and live a pretty reasonable life without relying on help all around him, and especially that of his brothers. So it's taken a toll on everybody, and everybody's got to have a sort of sacrifice for this, but knock on wood, hopefully it'll pay off. So
that's right. And we're talking with Erik Raschke. The book you should go look for is To the Mountain. That's the newest one. Also the author of the Book of Samuel, and that's been out for a while. Erik Raschke, as a professional writer, what's the hardest lesson you think you had to learn?
Oh my God, there's so many of them. Being a writer, it's just like a series of like hard lessons. Would you talk about the writing of the book, or after the book has been written? Because there's a whole sort of narrow it down there.
Oh, all of the above. Well, let's go for it. It's everything.
Well, I think I think the biggest ones are, like, especially when you're writing, is that there's a lot of stuff that you write that you put into a book, and you put your heart and soul and energy into it, and you rework it and rework it and rework it, and then you realize, it just doesn't work. and you have to cut it, and it's just hours and hours and hours of work, and it just, it's one little, click and it's gone. And I think that, like, this book right now, when I first wrote it, was 80,000 words, and by the time it went off to the publisher, it was 37,000 words. And there's no reason that the other 30,000 words, I had worked just as hard on them, it wasn't like they were poorly written or anything like that. It's just, it didn't work in terms of moving the story forward. And my editor was the editor of the guy who worked with me. My first editor, I had two editors on it. There was the publisher's editor too, and she was really great and sort of shifting certain things. But the first editor that I used, he was also the editor of The Revenant, and which is a book, but it's also the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio.
Right.
And yeah.
What was I going to say? How do you write? Do you write on a typewriter, computer, by hand? How do you?
I write on a computer. I've always written on a computer. Yeah. Yeah. So, but what was, just to finish the story, is what I was saying is that he was just very much like, like, what is this part doing? Is it moving the story forward, or is it holding it back? And I had never written like that, Once again, I studied creative writing in New York and stuff like that, and it was always about, like, sort of reaching deeper and deeper. And I never really just worked on pure story. And so with this, it was quite a learning curve for me to really just focus on moving the story along quickly and cutting out that didn't. And so that was a really hard lesson for me to learn, but I'm glad I did it. So I don't know if I'm going to do it again, but it was a good lesson. So
that's good. I don't know, the quote is attributed to Stephen King, but I don't know if it's accurate or not. But it's like, you got to kill your darlings. So you get these, you write a sentence, you think it's the best thing ever written since To Be or Not to Be, and nope, you have to get rid of it because, like you said, it doesn't contribute or to the story or move the story along, or doesn't belong there. You could have a poetic description of a morning sunlight with sparkling dew and all that, and it doesn't mean anything because meanwhile there's a guy holding a gun to the wife. So who cares what the sunshine's like when there's a tension going on in the story? So
yeah, and it's funny too, because the stuff that you think is also the best is not necessarily what other people think is the best. Like, for example, like with there's a part in my book, like, I thought there's some really beautiful parts there where the father's really thinking about the son, and and he's worried, because there's two characters. It's not just the son; it's also the father too. It goes back and forth, and the father, he goes through some really difficult things too, and he's just thinking about being with his son, and then the ending, this really touching moment, where he's just holding on to his son. And I thought, like, when my son read it, he was going to be like, wow, that's really touching. But no, his favorite part was, like, when Marshall fights a coyote in the lake, like, that was his favorite part. I'm like, that's like just an action scene. He's like, yeah, it's my favorite part. I'm like, but what about this part with the dad? And he was, his emotions and feelings about his son. He's like, yeah, it's okay. But the coyote, that was the best. That was really good. And that part was very close to being cut, actually. So you never know,
From the mouths of babes, as they say. Erik Raschke, To the Mountain is the book. It came from Tory Press, which is Tory House, rather. They're based in Salt Lake City. How did you get in touch with them?
Well, I really wanted to go on a different route with this book than I did with my last book. My last book was with a really big publisher, and it was not the most treasured experience of my writing career, and so I was kind of like, well, you know what I want to do? I want to just I want to see what it's like to go with a smaller publisher that spends a little bit more time on my writing and stuff like that. And I just was looking around at them, and I came across Story House, and one of their questions they said is, what do you think about Edward Abbey? I think it was Edward Abbey or something like that, because they asked you a couple questions before you submit your manuscript, and Edward Abbey was actually I did my undergraduate thesis on Edward Abbey, and I loved the man. I loved his writing, and he wrote like I can't Fire on the Mountain, and he wrote the Monkey Wrench Gang, and a lot of the Earth First stuff comes from him, even though he refuses to accept that. But I mean, he's the anarchist, nature loving guy, and I just loved his writing, and so I was like, I can answer this question, and I loved the fact that was one of their questions. It's just a lot of things clicked, and so I was like, yeah, I'd love to answer this question. I'll tell you exactly why I love it, and it was in an interview too with him that one of my favorite quotes from him was that when he won the Academy of Arts and Letters, he won an honorary degree from the Academy of Arts and Letters. He wrote him a letter saying, I'm on a raft right now, floating down the Green River, staring at the stars, and this is something better than any of the little boys in your club could ever experience, or your medal from your little boys club would ever give me. I thought that was such a great thing, So, and whether it really happened that way or not. So
that was Edward Abbey you're talking about, and Earth First. And funny you should mention that, because I'm just watching a series on the Unabomber in his own words, and Earth First is mentioned. But like you said, Edward Abbey doesn't necessarily espouse the Earth First sort of radical views of certain things. To the Mountain, Erik Raschke. You have a website, Erik. How do we find it?
Yeah, it's erikraschke.com. ERIKRASCHKE.com. Or if you just, you can find the book anywhere too. It's, you don't have to look at me. I'm not that interesting. So you can just go to Amazon, go to any bookstore or whatever and order it, or, order it online. To the Mountain by Erik Raschke. And yeah, I hope you enjoy it. I hope, I'm always interested to hear people's thoughts on it too. So, it's always nice to hear feedback from people.
There you have it. That is Erik Raschke, the book, To the Mountain. You heard it from the man himself. Go to the bookstore, buy it, order it online, something like that, and give him feedback. Erik, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a treat.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed this. I'm glad we made it work.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.